Okay, all the technology first. Uh, so good morning. This is the last talk of the 25-26 season. Can you believe? We went through 27 presentations, all brand new, by the way. So there was no repeat. But we made it. And so today we talk about John Singer Sargent, and I tell you, as I was saying a minute ago, I worked on it until the last minute because I was reading some more. And oh, I really have to show them this one, and this one is so interesting, and so on. So we'll have to go through it kind of fast, but we'll make it. Again, I'm not showing his whole works all his works, but I'm made a selection, and I know there are some really good ones I left aside, sometimes for the reason that I couldn't get a good reproduction. The reproductions show sometimes some colors that are completely different to the reality, and it's very difficult unless you have a good quality book. You can't certify that the color you show is the correct one. So anyway, here we'll talk at length about what you see in front of you, which is Sargent in his studio with the famous portrait of Madame X. As usual, a little history, because the time that Sargent lived through was a very busy time. We have the rise of the German Empire in 1871. It was up to then a series of states, up to 300 of them. And so this is now the reunification of Germany, but at that time under the German, as a German Empire. We have the second industrial revolution and urbanization. We have also that period that is known as La Belle Époque. And La Belle Époque also entitled some social changes, particularly in France. It is seen as the golden age of artistic, scientific, and cultural innovation. But it's also imperialism, a time of imperialism and the scramble for Africa, where European countries are going to share Africa between themselves. Unfortunately, this is also, for a different reason, a path to war. In fact, the German emperor really liked Paris and wanted to get it. So between 1870 to 1914, we see rising nationalism, imperial competition, and Balkan instability that fueled tensions. Of course, World War I between 1914 and 1918, that's an incredible amount of casualties and really changed the way war was fought. And then we have the post-war remaking of Europe between 1918 and 1920. It's really important to, let's make sure, yeah, to see, we have to talk about that because Sargent traveled a lot. So he was not concerned by only one country, but he was concerned by most of Europe as well as the United States. So the period between 1870 and the 70s and the 80s saw an intense industrialization, particularly in France, because France was behind because of the Napoleonic Wars and the big instability that existed during the monarchy under Louis Philippe and so on, and Charles X. Louis XVIII, they really lagged behind. And it's only under Napoleon III that the industry came back. And really at that time, full speed, where they went from having no railway when the other countries already had it. In about 30 years, they became the country with the most railway in Europe, just as an example. It sees the unification of Italy and Germany, and the beginning of new imperialism, as we said before. 1890s to 1914, intense competition for colonies, technological breakthroughs, and there's a whole list among them, telephone, radio, and rising social unrest. World War I, we mentioned it, but between 18 and 20, the Russian Revolution, of course, happened, the collapse of the Central Empires, and the beginning of the interwar period marked by political volatility. Here is just the timeline that shows us John Singer Sargent here in the middle. In yellow, we have Joaquim Sorolla, a Spanish painter that we'll see a few works of them during this, because there is a lot of things to be compared, though I just had a talk with our in-house artist here in Jerry Salinas, who is totally in love with Sorolla and likes Sargent, but as he says, he really became an artist when he started doing watercolor, and we'll see some of them. I don't fully agree with him, but I think he's kind of biased. But anyway, a lot of people were saying that and confirming that. Whistler, of course, also an expat, lived in London and was, in a sense, he saw Singer Sargent as almost a rival in the sense of notoriety, but he accuses Sargent of certain things that he did himself, which is quite interesting. And we'll see one example. In the States, of course, we have Thomas Eakins, who is a contemporary, and Mary Chase, who was a friend of Sargent and worked with him a lot. And they, among many things, they painted the Spanish dancer Carmencita together. And I put down below Edouard Manet, who had some influence on Sargent, and Claude Monet, who knew Sargent. Sargent is going to paint Monet, and he knew he'd been to Giverny. So that gives you an idea of when he lived. In fact, John Singer Sargent, who everybody knows is an American, was not born in America. He was born in Florence. Before his birth, his father, Fitzwilliam Sargent, from Massachusetts, was an eye surgeon in the Wills Eye Hospital in Philadelphia from 1844 to 1854. But after John's older sister died at the age of 2, his mother suffered a breakdown, and the couple decided to go abroad to recover. And they remained nomadic for the rest of their lives. Although based in Paris, Sargent's parents moved regularly, spending seasons at the sea and at the mountain resorts in France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. While Mary was pregnant, they stopped in Florence because of a cholera epidemic. Sargent was born there in 1856. A year later, his sister Mary was born. In 1858, Fitzwilliam reluctantly resigned his post in Philadelphia and accepted his wife's request to remain abroad. They lived modestly in a small inheritance, on a small inheritance and savings, leading a quiet life with their children. And they generally avoided society and other Americans, except for friends in the art world. 4 more children were born abroad, of whom only 2 lived past childhood. His mother was convinced that traveling around Europe and visiting monuments and churches would be a good way of educating John. But several attempts to have him more formally schooled failed because of the fact they had that itinerant life, but also because he was a busybody. He couldn't stay sitting at the same place. You know, you gain that discipline when you put in school. So both parents were pretty good draftmen. The father could, draw the eyes, and so scientific drawings, and his mother dabbled in watercolor and other media. And so they gave him a lot of push, if you want, to go on the artistic side. And so he received some watercolor lessons from a German landscape painter, but otherwise, it's until he was an adolescent, an older adolescent, that he could get some classes. However, he was fluent in English, French, Italian, and German. So at 17, Sargent was described as willful, curious, determined, and strong. That's after his mother, but yet shy, generous, and modest after his father. He was well acquainted with many of the great masters. Of course, he'd been, imagine, you go to Florence, you go to Venice, so you go to the museum, you go to the churches. He had seen everything on the side. It's this almost the same as with Michelangelo, that claimed later in life that he had learned everything by himself, which was not correct, because we have the paper, the contract of him working in Florence with Ghirlandaio. So, but when Michelangelo was born, he could go around Florence and have all the early Renaissance master under his eyes, so he could learn just a lot by himself. So in Paris in 1874, he tried to study at the Academy. No, he tried first the Academy of Florence, and that he failed. But he returned to Paris from Florence, and he began his art studies with the young French portraitist that you see here, Carolus Duran. And Carolus Duran was a new method type of guy. And they got along pretty well. He worked for almost 4 years with him. His influence on Sargent was really pivotal. Joan is there. Yes. Do you have two chairs there? Okay, there are 2 chairs there. So he studied with him. And what was interesting with Carolus Duran, he was pushing him to go to Spain and learn from Velázquez. He was absolutely crazy about the works of Velázquez. So at the age of 23, this is a portrait he made, Sargent made, of Carolus Duran. I think it's a pretty nice effort. And this came with a lot of public approval when they saw his work. He showed that piece at the Paris Salon, and as a tribute to his teacher, but also as an advertisement to his talent as portrait commission. Sargent started as a landscape painter. He really loved landscape and still lifes and so on. And it's Carolus Duran who saw his talent and who pushed him to go for portraiture. We have to realize too that portraiture is bread making. That's the bread. That's how you live. Because you still had, even though photography already existed, but having a beautiful portrait was setting you in society, gave you the standing in society. So he knew that when he was doing that, he was giving him a hand in really being able to survive in that career. This is a work by Carolus Duran, where you can see the Spanish woman portrait of, actually, Eva Gonzalez was a painter herself. She was an impressionist painter, very little known. She died very young, but she was part of the 4 women considered impressionist painters. And then he decided to share a studio with James Carroll Beckwith. And here is a profile portrait of Carroll Beckwith. And he became a really good friend until, of course, Beckwith left back to the US. He took also some lessons from Léon Bonnat. And here's an interesting portrait by Beckwith of Mark Twain. He painted outdoor. This is, of course, that was the fashion at the time. The idea that you would get the atmosphere, the real light. Though in France, with a kind of a climate that changed constantly, it's not always easy. But as you know, by then, they could use the little tubes of paint instead of having to make their own mixture. And they would go around, and as you can see, they had an easel and a little canvas, and they would be painting. So here he's painting some friends doing an outside study. Through his friend Paul César, actually the guy is Paul César Helleu, and through his friend Helleu, Sargent met all the big names of the time, including Degas, Rodin, Monet, and Whistler. These are his early portraits, and you can already feel where he's going to, just the attitude, the way he sets the sitter, and then a kind of a plain background. This was his childhood friend, Fanny Watts. But he also liked some outdoor paintings. And this is where we will compare him and Sorolla, because they have that similar light in the works. This portrait is fishing for oysters at Cancale in northern France. He then traveled again to Italy, and this is some views of Anna Capri, close to Capri. And there he had some friends, artists, including a friend, Frank Hyde, and he worked in his studio. Frank Hyde was at that time using as a model the young lady that you see there, whose name was Ferrara. And Sargent became completely obsessed with her, now not emotionally, but as a model, because she was so pretty. So he made absolutely a whole series of 12 paintings of her, just taken by her beauty. Here is a study of a head of Rosina Ferrara, and that he actually gifted to Hyde later on. She was of Greek ancestry, was born in Anacapri in 1861. In 91, she went to Rome and married an American painter, George Randolph Bars of Detroit, and moved to the United States shortly after the marriage. They lived in Westchester County, New York. In 1934, she died of pneumonia, and 4 years later, he committed suicide. And here's another painting of Rosina. And probably the most known is this one of Rosina dancing the tarantella on the roof of a house in Capri. And he has just that sense of the composition, you know, that White House, and then the girl dancing on top, and then you have the background, the mountains in the background. And this is already kind of looking forward to what we'll see of his travels to Spain. Far less full of light is this one, another very good painting of a Venetian onion seller. But this was really good. It was studying past Europe, studying different kind of models and different kind of light. And there, of course, you have the beautiful little window and the landscape in the background. He came back to Paris in 1879, and this is the kind of portrait he's going to start getting. It's not yet the very high part of society, but a good bourgeois custom base with Madame Edouard Payron. He definitely exhibited many portraits at the Salon and continued to receive positive critical notice. We know that Sargent spent quite a bit of time in Spain. Carolus Duran had really pushed him to go there. He loved the light that he could find there. He loved also artists like Velázquez and Goya. And so between 1879 and 1912, he did numerous trips to Spain. And here you see him at the Alhambra in Granada, painting some of the beautiful arches and texture of the surface. So here you have a map of Spain with the different days. So from 1879, 1892, 1895, 1903, and 1908 and 1912. And of course, he stops because then the First World War will start, and some problems in Spain too. But so you see a really extensive type of trips where he would really cover all the aspects that you have in Spain, from La Coruña, which is a cloudy place with a lot of winds and a lot of rain, next to Santiago de Compostela, but he really loved Malaga and Sevilla and Granada and so on. Barcelona, he went quite often, and he went around Madrid to Toledo and the Escorial and so on. So, of course, he's going to see the works of Velázquez, and not only Las Meninas, but many of his portraits or his paintings like the philosophers and so on. And that's really going to mark him. And we'll see in some of his portraits how he reproduced that kind of expressions. But even this one, we'll see, is going to have some influence on him. Francisco Goya, same thing. He is going to be influenced by him. But also he's going to influence by Manet. Manet, who went to Spain and came back totally transformed. And this is a painting that Manet made of Lola de Valencia, normally, the Lola de Valence, where he shows them, and we'll see a parallel with one of the paintings by Sargent. He, his first love was landscape, and so cityscape. This is one of his paintings, the Alhambra, the Paseo de los Arayanes in Granada, which is beautiful, the reflection in the pond, in the basin. But from there, while he was in the south of Spain, he also went to the north of Africa. And this is one, I think it's an absolutely wonderful painting of the fumée d'ambergris, smoke of ambergris, with that woman who is in front of that censer, and you have that smoke coming up, and she extends her veil just to capture the scent. And if you like me, I had no idea what ambergris was. It's actually a waxy substance extracted from whales. It was used in some religious rituals and was also said to have aphrodisiac qualities. So there you are. And so he began this painting in Tangier, where a model posed for him, but he completed it in the Paris studio. What is interesting too is this was the fashion at that time of white on white paintings. But anyway, he became a really good friend with Henry James. And Henry James wrote a lot about Sargent paintings. And this is what he saw. He loved that painting. And so he said, the charming, dusky, white-robed person stands on a rug under a great white Moorish arch. And from out of the shadows of the large drapery, raised pentwise by her hands, which covers her head, looks down, with painted eyes and brows showing above a bandaged mouth, at the fumes of a beautiful censer or chafing dish placed on the carpet. I know not who the stately Mohammedan may be, nor in what mysterious domestic or religious rite she may be engaged, but in her muffled contemplation and her pearl-colored robes under her plastered arcade, which shines in the eastern light, she is beautiful and memorable. The picture is exquisite, a radiant effect of white upon white. And this is, of course, if you remember, the same thing that happened with Whistler. So you can see that at that time, the painters were challenging themselves in making this type of paintings of white on white and be able to show the different texture with different use, if you want, of white. This is the famous Symphony in White #1 with his mistress of the time, Joanna Hifferman. But what really fascinated Sargent was the music and the dance. And of course, he was himself a pretty good musician. And so he was entranced with the Spanish music and the dances. So flamenco was a lot for him. So going to Seville and going to Granada or going to Cordoba, he would be able to witness these type of dances. So just for your information, because we'll see the painting of the jaleo. The jaleo is the rhythmic hand clapping and vocal interjection used to encourage and support the performers. When you go to a flamenco dance, you hear that ole, and they just push, and then they have that magnificent way of clapping their hands, either making a cavernous sound just by keeping your hands curved, or flat, then it's a more metallic sound. And they go in contrast with that. So this is called the palmas, is the clapping of the hands. But you have the sordas with the cupped hands and the altas with stiff fingers. The bailaor is the dancer male, and the bailaora is the female dance, which is a different word than for a regular dancer. A dancer is a bailaor, but bailao is for flamenco, and bailaora is for flamenco too. The zapateado is the footwork with the very rapid percussive stamping of the feet. And then you have these very expressive arm movements, the braceo and floreo. Pitos are the finger snapping. Cantaor is the singer and again, for flamenco. And toque is the guitar playing. The form of dance that is associated with the Andalusian Roma, the gypsies, has its roots most probably all the way back to India. Here you can see a Kathak dancer in India. And this is where the Roma were coming. Originally, the Roma comes from India and then did the whole trek through the western part of Asia and then through Europe, where they settled in different places. They reached Europe by the 14th century. And here you have an idea of how, starting from the south, the green arrow, and then they went and spread all over, went down to Africa and came back up to Spain too. And depending where they settled, the original language is tainted by the local language. And so they can understand somewhat, but the languages differ. And the Spaniards are about the only one that dance. The others, most of them don't dance. So it's really that immersion, if you want, with probably the Muslim population that was at the time. Don't forget, Spain was under Muslim ruling until 1492. So at least the southern part. So the Roma actually were called Doma at the beginning, and it turned into Roma or Romani during their arrival through the Balkan. They named by different names. Tsigan, they also were thought at the time to come from Egypt, but which is not correct. So here you see a Café Cantante in Seville in about the time where Sargent was there. So the gypsies were inspired by the religious songs, Christian Mozarabic songs. So these were the Mozarabic, were the people, the Muslim that were that became Christian after 1492, and so they kept that mixture of Arabic songs as well as the religious Christian songs. And you have that kind of mixture that happens. And they were inspired by this in Mozarabic rites. So here are a series of paintings that were made by Sargent. Just here, the Spanish gypsy dancer at the very beginnings of his arrival to Spain. And you can see also the link with Rosina Ferrara. You have almost the same feel. He did some Spanish dances. And this is the kind of painting that Whistler would criticize, I would say, not even critique, but criticize in saying that was muddy. And it's funny because Whistler himself made paintings that gave the similar feel with the fireworks along the Thames, where he paints, and he was himself criticized, and he went through a trial because he was asking too much money for a painting where he had thrown the paint, according to the judge. So it's interesting that he criticizes the Sargent for this. This is the study for the painting we'll see later on. So the study for El Jaleo. That trip also reawakened his own talent for music, which he nearly equaled to his artistic talent. At the time when he will be disgusted with what's happening to him, he contemplated going back to music and become a musician. So he was pretty good. And he would advocate for modern composers quite a bit, including Gabriel Fauré. So Spanish dances make excellent subject for paintings, and especially that they were very successful when he came back, they were selling well. And he is, of course, his very famous Jaleo painting that was exhibited in Boston, and the patron that became a friend, Isabella Stewart Gardner, expressed her interest in it, but it belonged to somebody else, but she finally convinced that person to sell it to her. And of course, she built literally almost a gallery for it. The wonderful thing you can see, he had studied her and he finished the painting. I'm sure he was using photography to help him because the painting was finished in studio, and all the background is something that he finished later on in his studio. But it's a dramatic light, you have to figure out that at that time you didn't have electricity to really light on these things. So these were a different kind of lamp, and it gives that tragic light to the dancer with excessive shadows. And this is now El Jaleo in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And so you can see that Isabella Gardner literally built that whole gallery to have the dramatic effect of the Spanish dancer El Jaleo. She actually even had originally a pond on the side of the walkway to have the reflection. But then what is interesting, the love for Spain was sustained by some meetings. In 1890, the young woman that you see there, La Carmencita, whose name was Carmen Doce Moreno, came and danced in Paris. She was getting out of Spain because of her talent. She was getting out of Spain, but then did Paris, and then she was invited to come to the States. And she was at that time pursued by both Sargent and Mary Chase, who wanted both to paint her, convinced her to come, and she came in the studio and posed for them. So it's very interesting because you would believe she would be shown dancing. But in fact, Sargent decides to paint her very similarly to what Manet had done before in a static pose. Here you have the installation with her original costume that is absolutely superb, all embroidered like this. So La Carmencita is going to follow them. She was extremely known, as I mentioned. Here is the painting, on the other hand, by Mary Chase, who shows her in action and dancing. Later on, they had talked, so of course, Isabella Gardner was very much in love with the painting El Jaleo. And so when they were in Boston, they heard that Carmencita was there. And so they convinced Isabella Gardner to attend a dance by her, invited her in a place that was where she could express her dancing. And the Gardner sat down and really loved it. Though Sargent had a problem with her because she couldn't stop moving. You can imagine. And then she was plastered with makeup, and Sargent didn't like that. So he was trying to rub off the makeup, and she didn't like it. So there's a lot of anecdotes of the two of them. But here you see the big change where he shows her dancing. After a good tour of the US, she went back to Europe and died only at age 49. So definitely we can see the influence of Velázquez on the works of Sargent. This wonderful painting showing the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd shows the influence of the Las Meninas, that sense of perspective and people not really looking at each other, that isolation. These are the four daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. And it's beautifully composed because you see these very large temple vases that are there, that are disproportionate with the girls and make it so majestic. Just a great sense of composition, and it has become known as one of the most interesting painting that he did. Edward Boyd was the son-in-law of John Perkins Cushing and a friend of Sargent. He was a minor painter himself. And here's the interesting way, exhibited in MFA with the two original temple vases on either side. He went on doing portraits. As we know, this was going to be his life. Mostly he's known as a portrait painter, though personally he didn't really like the process, and can understand that every time when he was with these very important people, he had 5, 6, 7 sittings, and he had to entertain them the whole time while working. And not all of them were pleasant. You can imagine. So this is the Dame à la Rose, which is going to be one of the first portraits that he's going to exhibit, and that is going to really be a success. And he's believed to he might have had a little affair with Charlotte Louise Burckhardt. There are some ideas that they were very close to each other. What is interesting, she married, she was the 20-year-old daughter of a Swiss merchant from Basel. She was the first wife of the fruit importer, the banana king, Roger Ackerley. And she died after 2 years of marriage. So very young. Now, let's have fun. Let's talk about Dr. Samuel Jean Baudzier. He was a French surgeon and gynecologist. He was also interested in anthropology and neurology. After studying medicine in Paris, he volunteered to be a medic during the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. He later specialized in gynecological and abdominal surgery, establishing the first chair of gynecology in Paris in 1884 and performing the first gastroenterostomy in France. He was elected to the French Academy of Medicine in 1896 and co-founded the Review of Gynecology, the Gynécologie and the Chirurgie Abdominale in 1897. In the political arena, Baudzier served as a senator for his hometown Bergerac and supported Alfred Dreyfus during his trial. What is interesting, we'll see the rest of the context. He died in 1918 when a disgruntled patient fatally shot him. He had made the surgery in his privates, and the guy claimed that he had become impotent since, which was apparently not the case. But anyway, he killed him. So, as you can see by the painting, he was a very coquet. He was vain. He had himself painted in that sumptuous scarlet dressing gown. It is the image of the born seducer. He was known all around. He was married, had at least a daughter because she wrote her memoir and talked about him. But he had mistresses all around, not only in his patients, but also with famous people. This is a photography by Nadar, the great photographer, in 1865, during the time he had an affair with Sarah Bernard. And you see the names around. You have Sarah Bernard here on the left. You have Réjeanne on the top to the right, as well as Georgette Leblanc, who was a soprano and author on the lower part. He was known as Dr. God, the doctor in love. Oh, sorry, Doctor in Love, the siren, because he was so elegant and he knew his way around women. So, as I say, he loved women passionately, just as he loved everything beautiful. He dedicated his life to them. So this is quite an interesting thing. So when I saw that painting, I said, I know that name. And it relates to somebody that nobody talks about in the literature here. But in another series of presentations I had made of Misia Sert, I don't know if some people remember Misia Sert. She was very instrumental in helping the Nabis and the post-impressionist painters, married well twice, and so was able to really, they had even a publication and so on. And Misia, who was of Russian and Polish origin, had lived in Belgium, was called by her father, who was a widower and had remarried, had settled in Paris, was called to come and live with him, remembered these evenings with Dr. Pozzi at her parents' house, where the parents had become the center for the Polish expatriates in Paris. So they would come and gather at the house. And apparently he was giving gynecological advices during these meetings. And the girl, Misia, remembered all these strange laughters that were coming from the room. So I said, oh my gosh, that's the famous Dr. Pozzi. He was indeed a handsome guy, let's put it that way. And so he is a caricature that shows a whole series of mostly surgeons, and the one with the beard in the background there is Dr. Pozzi. So in many of the portraits we're going to see, particularly the ladies, the house of worth is going to be a center point. Most of the beautiful dresses that you see come from the house of worth. Charles Frederick Worth, who was born in 1825, was an English fashion designer who founded the House of Worth, but which was placed in Paris and became one of the foremost fashion houses of the 19th and early 20th century. He is considered by many to be the father of the haute couture. He is also credited with revolutionizing the business of fashion. He established himself in Paris in 1858 and soon attracted a European royalty that really were the starter. He became, for example, the designer not only for Empress Eugenia, so who was the wife of Napoleon III, but of the Empress Sissi in Austria. So the beautiful dress where she's painted by, it's a Winterhalter, was made by Worth. So every beautiful dress that you're going to see were coming from the house of Worth. And he's going to adapt the 19th century dress to make it more suited to everyday life. So he was not only doing evening gowns, but he was doing everyday dresses. And the Empress Eugenia was very instrumental in asking him to be more practical. So he's going to cut the dresses shorter when she was walking. She wanted something where she could walk better. And so he is the one who brought up the hem. And you see, that was his favorite outfit, which I find really funny. So he's also the first one that replaces the fashion dolls with live models in order to promote his garment to the clients. And he also was the first one to sew branded labels into the clothing. That's quite interesting. By the end of his career, the fashion house has employed 1,200 people. Yeah, most of everything was done by hand. They started in the middle of his tenure to have the first sewing machine, but that was only done for certain things, mostly seam, but hemming would always be done by hand, and all the application and so on would be done by hand. As an example of the scale of Worth's business with the Empress, for the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, she had decided she needed 250 Worth dresses. Now, his evening gowns were running around $5,000 of the time.
Sorry, did we miss a slide?
So here is an example of the atelier where you had one dress. Of course, each customer had its own bust. And so they had the measurements, and you had the bust for Madame such and Madame such and Madame such, and they would fit the dress on that. So you typically had 5, 6 person for one dress. Madame Margaret Stuyvesant Rutherford White was one of the first person that he painted from higher society. So they started wanting to have Sargent capture their status in these beautiful portraits. And he would exhibit these portraits at the annual Paris Salon. So when the lady here saw the famous painting with the lady with the rose, she decided that she wanted a painting by Sargent and contacted him to do it so. And so she was apparently quite a beautiful woman with impeccable skin, so no blemish and no makeup at all. And she's the one who is going to introduce him to Madame Gautreau. And so we will take a little break before we start that scandal. So if we could put the lights on, just let's stretch.
Oh, I can't wait.
Hi, Cynthia. And you ain't seen nothing.
One of my favorites.
I know, me
And
too.
I've seen that Art Institute, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So summer, they had an exhibit at John Stevens in Paris. I don't typically see a lot of pictures, I just like to enjoy. I took photos of my 2 favorite paintings, and here they are. the first, and then, because I love Las Canitas, and I don't know the based on that, same feel. But it's just so funny, was it, I thought familiar and oh. Yeah. Don't go too far, we can stop there. Going to get from her feet. I'll bring that down. Yeah. No, you don't.
Man, that is so packed.
Your foot is.
Yeah, you know, so we have it, it's happened like.
Okay, people, please, if we could take your seats. Uh, Somebody can flick the light, yeah, that's probably the, please, can you take your seats, please? As I told you, you have much more to see. And Lud is gone. Yeah, I know that there's, Lud is there, okay, so we're gonna wait until he sits down. Okay. Don't close it entirely because it often locks up and then you can't open it anymore. Leave it that way. Thank you so much, Alice. Okay, so this scandal, this has really put Sargent on the stage, and unfortunately, it ended up being a negative result. But still nowadays, when you talk about Sargent, the first image you have in your mind is Madame X. Okay, who was Madame X? Madame X was Virginie Amélie Avignon, who was born into a New Orleans family of former French immigrants and that moved to Paris in 1867 and married the businessman Pierre Gautreau in 1879 and became an important figure in the Third Republic's social life. She was acknowledged as one of the great beauties of her day. Her appearances and outfits were described in exquisite detail in the press. The painting was not commissioned by her. It was actually Sargent who was interested in her, who pursued her for the opportunity, quite unlike most of his portrait work where the clients sought him out. He wrote to a common acquaintance, "I have a great desire to paint her portrait and have reason to think she would allow it, and is waiting for someone to propose this homage to her beauty. You might tell her that I am a man of prodigious talent." And modest, of course. So he convinced her. It took well over a year to complete the painting. The first version of the portrait of Madame Gautreau with the famously plunging neckline, by the way, a dress, that's a Worth dress by the House of Worth. Famous plunging neckline, white powdered skin, and arrogantly cocked head featured an intentionally suggestive off-the-shoulder dress strap. And I'm looking at it again and again, and I said, you know, when you look at the dress all together, having the strap down or up really doesn't make a difference to me. But to tell you at the time, there was such decorum that certain things were admitted and some were not. And so it apparently for people gave them an overall effect of more daring and sensual aspect. So when they unveiled in Paris at the 1884 Salon, it aroused such negative reaction that he repainted the strap to its expected over-the-shoulder position to try to dampen the furor, but the damage had been done. So isn't that interesting? I mean, think about nowadays. Gosh. So anyway, the thing that is interesting, because definitely, and the rest of her life, Madame Gautreau was a woman who was trying to make herself known. She wanted to position herself in society as one of the top ladies at the time. And the furor was such that her mother and her begged Sargent to take the painting down because it was so bad. So many who saw the portrait were shocked by Gautreau's haughty demeanor, provocative dress, and the dramatic artificiality of her cosmetics. In addition to displaying her daringly bare shoulders and plunging décolleté, Sargent originally painted, yeah, as I mentioned, it was there. But so she was called a professional beauty, a woman who audaciously used her appearance to gain celebrity and advance in her social standing. As a result, French commissions dried up, and he told his friend Edmund Goss in 1885 that he was contemplating giving up painting for music or business. So bad it was. But so this had backfired. And we now know that the portrait of Madame X is now considered one of his best work. And he actually always considered it as one of his best work. So the he never sold the painting. He didn't sold the painting until late, sorry. And here you can see it again in his studio with Madame X. It became only Madame X once he sold it to the Metropolitan. Because by the time, finally, so they kept the painting in his studio, and then Madame Gautreau died. And it's only after she died that he decided that he really wanted that painting to go to an important museum in the US. And under the condition that her name would not be disclosed and that it would be called Madame X. And so he actually sent the portrait across the Atlantic to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. And it's at the time he decided he wanted to sell it. He is actually a letter to the former director, Ned Robinson, where he proposes to sell the painting to the Met for $1,100. And of course, Ned Robinson, who knew that he had the painting, was extremely interested in getting it over. He is actually a portrait of Edward Robinson by Sargent. So Robinson had become the Met, came to the Met as assistant director in 1905, before being appointed director in 1910. Sargent and him got along extremely well, and so he collaborated with him to get some of his paintings to the Met. So after receiving Sargent's offer of Madame X on January 22nd, 1916, Robinson wrote to the museum's committee on purchases and explained, "I have tried in vain for years to get this picture from him, but for personal reasons, he's always refused to part with it. And his change of decision, therefore, comes as a complete surprise." And so he thought the price was very moderate, too. And so they approved the purchase immediately. And so he telegrammed Sargent, "Museum takes Gautreau portrait at price named with thanks for opportunity." And in response, Sargent suggested, "I should prefer, on account of the row I had with the lady years ago, that this picture should not be called by her name." And so that's why it became Madame X. Another friend of his, Louis de Fourcault, who was an art critic, recognized the portrait of Gautreau as a characterization of a new type of woman who used her appearance to acquire celebrity and social standing. Someone who was famous simply for being famous. What is interesting is she had her portrait made by two other painters later on. And guess what? the strap is down. So, you know, where the whole raw about it seems to be kind of overdone. As we know, Sargent had met Monet. And so this is a picture of Claude Monet painting by the edge of a wood, and probably with one of his stepdaughters, the daughters of Madame Hochedet, who is going to marry after the death of his first wife. Sargent really looked at Monet quite a bit, and they became really close. He went to visit him at Giverny more than once. And we'll see that with some of his work at that time, you have the influence of the Impressionist, though the brushwork is different. It's the research for the light that is the same. So he decides that Paris is done for him, at least to live in, and he moved to Chelsea, England in 1886. Actually, as I said, he had already contemplated moving in 1882. He had been very careful. He was a pretty good businessman. And so before arriving in England, he sent paintings for exhibition at the Royal Academy. So his name would be more and more known there. And this included, again, the portraits of Dr. Pozzi and the traditional Madame Henry White also. By the way, Dr. Pozzi was extremely opposed for women to become doctors. And at length, I mean, he was adamant that it was not good for the profession and it wouldn't be good for the women either. So the art critics were not very warm at first on his work, but then he started having great contacts, and it changed little by little. This is one of the first known paintings he did then. It's a beautiful carnation lily rose that is at the Tate in London, and it depicts two small children dressed in white who are lighting paper lanterns as they turn to evening. The painting is dominated by green foliage with no horizon or no other horizontal line to give a sense of depth. So you almost feel that you're at the same level as the children. Dolly at the left was 11-year-old, and Polly at the right was 7 years old, sorry. And the title comes from the refrain of a popular song, Ye Shepherds Tell Me, by Joseph Mazingi. And it tells a wreath around her head she wore a carnation lily rose. This was actually in an English garden at Farnham House in Broadway. And this is one of the paintings, probably one of the most impressionistic paintings that Sargent did. And you can compare it to the Monet with his stepdaughter in the fields with the umbrella. It has a little bit of the same. This was done in Calcutta Mill, Oxfordshire. Then, of course, as he was a busybody, he decides he wants to go back to the US a little bit, New York and Boston. His first trip to New York as a professional artist in 1887-88, he produced over 20 important commissions, including the portraits of Isabella Stewart Gardner. And in Boston, he was honored with his first solo exhibition, which presented 22 of his paintings. And of course, including the famous portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardner. Actually, you would believe that Gardner would have avoided him after the scandal of Madame X, but actually she sought it out. She was introduced to him by Henry James, and had seen the notorious painting in Sargent's London studio, and immediately decided, I want a portrait by him. And I think that was in her nature. She was looking for scandals too. So they Sargent very quickly became the portraitist of choice for American elites. And of course, having Isabella Gardner was not a little thing. He considered her as an opinionated sitter. And she was wearing an evening gown designed by the Paris couturier Charles Frederick Worth. That's one more. Though I think it's very tame when you look at that one. The result is that magnificent and provocative fusion of the pair's mutual interest in iconic imagery and fashion. She had an idea. He came and he wanted a background, and he had all these brocade and things with him, and he was bringing them out and saying, she said, no, I know exactly what I want. And that was the whole idea. So she brought up that piece of Italian furnishing, silk, cut voided velvet and gilt yarn. And she said, this is what I want behind me. And of course, immediately what you see that is an aura that surrounds her head. And you have two ideas. It could look like a Madonna with a halo, or it could look like Buddha and a halo. So quite interesting. Here you can see she's very symmetrical, very, looking at you front, no looking on the side or whatever. And I think that was part of her character. And that's the piece of cloth that she had displayed behind her. So the public reaction was decidedly sexist and predictably scandalized when the portrait debuted at the Sint-Botolph Club in 1888. The painting became a target, enabling local audiences to condemn her entitlement. And that was jealousy. They didn't like women that were upfront and were taking care of their own business. And that was still very much, and she was disregarding the convention placed on the upper class women. Her black dress was no more revealing than those of other portrait sitters, but she was, as they say, public comments about her being painted all the way down to Crawford's notch. And that was rumor, that was going after a rumor that she had an affair with Marion Crawford, the novelist, 14 years her junior. And here's the famous portrait seen in the museum. And as I mentioned, he starts having commissions. And this is the portrait of Mrs. Adrian Island, wife of the New York businessman. And it really reveals her character. You look at that painting and you know she's not easy. That's definitely. She was one of the most prominent and wealthy wealthy family. The husband was an affluent banker and dry goods merchant. They lived in New York, and they were active members of high society and supporters of the city cultural centers. Her daughters, Georgine and Emily, commissioned the portrait from Sargent in the spring of 1888. And what is interesting is you imagine Sargent coming into the house, and she comes in and she's followed by a servant who carries a whole series of gowns, because typically Sargent would always pick the dress that they would wear when they were painted. And he looked at her and she was dressed like this. And he said, no, this one will be. And she was kind of taken aback because this was a day dress. And she probably wanted an evening gown, not. And so you can see that she's not too happy. And what is adorable is that what he has at the memory, people were saying, do you remember Madame Island? And he said, of course, cannot forget the dominating little finger. The little finger at the corner of the table. But he still liked landscapes, and that's something you can see. And his landscapes are so fresh. and so beautiful. He became friends with the painter Dennis Miller Bunker, who traveled to England in the summer of '88 to paint with him en plein air. And so here you see him with his wife along that little thing. Unfortunately, Bunker died from meningitis at the age of 29. Yeah, life was not easy, believe me. And then finally, his dream, he is going to be elected as an associate of the Royal Academy, and then was made a full member 3 years later. And this was, it's a question of standing, quite important. So taking advantage of this, just a quick word on what were his working methods. So after securing a commission through negotiation, which he carried out, Sargent would visit the client's home to see where the painting was to hang, to make sure that the light that was striking the painting would be in accordance with what he does. And that was typical. Rubens was doing that. Titian was doing that. These were things normal. He would often review a client's wardrobe to pick up the suitable attire. Some portraits were done in the client's home, but more often in his studio. 8 to 10 sittings from his clients, but normally captured the face in one sitting. Kept a pleasant conversation. That was the heavy thing for him. A pleasant conversation, and sometimes would take a break and play the piano for his sitter. He seldom used pencil or oil sketches and instead laid down oil paint directly. Finally, he would select an appropriate frame. Sargent had no assistants. He handled all the tasks, such as preparing his canvases, varnishing the painting, arranging for photography, shipping, and documentation. He commanded about $5,000 per portrait, or about $130,000 in current dollars.
One Worth dress,
Pardon?
or one dress from Worth.
plus the dress from Worth. So imagine. So we're going to go through a few of these extraordinary sitting, and what I admire with him, they're all completely different. Not only are the lady different, but the pose, the position, the light, the expression that he wants. So in the 1890s, he averaged 14 portrait commissions per year. None more beautiful than the genteel Lady Agnew of Lucknow in 1892. They came to him dressed in the latest mode. He frequently ignored or simplified the details, concentrating on texture, drape, and the way fabric responded to light. By the way, he knew Worth because they were going around the same type of society. And they don't know that they ever became friends, but they obviously did talk in different events. So exploiting dress as an integral ingredient of his own artistry, Sargent used clothes to proclaim his own aesthetic agenda whilst simultaneously establishing his sitter's social position, profession, gender identity, and nationality. The portrait of Miss Hugh Armsley was very well received, and she was one of the most notable hostesses in London. And you see, look at the difference with the other fabric that was a very light fabric. This is velvet, and he can capture the way he represents velvet with the embroidery there. And she's not resting backward, she's moving forward. There's all these little details. He was considered as the Van Dyck of his time, which is interesting because Van Dyck, the Flemish painter, had come to London and became the craze in London, and had everybody that had a name had to have a portrait made by Van Dyck. And this happened exactly the same with him. Then he exhibited at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, and brought a whole series, he brought about almost 10 paintings to the exposition. Now just showing you A few, I think there's going to be some that you have seen. No, but one that is here extraordinary is the Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth. So this is a theater outfit, but not the simplest costume. It's considered as probably the most beautiful costume made in the 19th century in England. For the very reason, so you see that, and you will see immediately the difference of color between the real costume that we still have and the portrait, but think that the light on the stage made the color change. And so that explains the difference. Here is the dress, as it's still in the Kent, it's in small height, it's in a National Trust. It's called a beetle wing dress, and you will see why. Here is a detail of the fabric, and if you look at the detail, these are actually elytra of beetles, so that part that protects the wings, and that is very shiny. This is the beetle. And so these elytra that protect the wings have that iridescent, extraordinary color. And these are sewn sparsely on the fabric. To imagine now, if you have torches or that light, how this must have reverberated the light on the stage. Absolutely extraordinary. And it's incredible that they were able to keep that dress and restore it. I think they spent quite a bit of money restoring it. They spent £110,000 to restore that dress. He also brought this very different painting of the study from life. It's a young Egyptian girl that he painted, the study. As well as the portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife. He was a good friend of Stevenson. He's there seen pacing in his dining room in an 1885 portrait. His wife, Fanny, is seated in an Indian dress, sitting there. Sargent said he's never seen anybody as dynamic as Stevenson. By the time he paints him, he had already written his masterpiece, and he was actually in the middle of writing the, what is the name again of, oh gosh, it's Mr. Hyde. Oh, come on. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was in the process. It says maybe he was thinking about it. You can see him just restless, and the writers. Just very different painting. As you can see, it's darker. He's not looking for light except for the wife, but more of the figure, the personality of the writer. And then we have that series of beautiful portraits full of light. This is Mrs. Karl Mayer and her children, that shows her with her children, Elsie and Frank. This is one of his most beloved portraits. Now, again, you always have the critique. They always have to find something. So the review in the Harper's Weekly was, of those elements of Mr. Sargent has made a picture of knockdown insolence, of talent and truth of characterization, a wonderful rendering of life, of manners, of aspect, of type, of texture, and of everything. The gorgeous fabrics and intensity of this famous hostess is as celebrated in this painting as her lack of concern about her offspring, whose tenuous hold on her is graphically illustrated by Sargent's outrageous composition. And here you can see, this is why I love these blue. Look at the the highlight, how it's obvious. You really see his brushwork. But once you move back, you can't. You just see the light. And how he suggests the tapestry on the sofa is also quite interesting. He considered this was the one of the most eccentric yet telling of any portraits anywhere at any time. And here it is, where it was supposed to sit. Also here, the Wyndham sisters, one of his largest work. And here, normally, he was sufficiently well known to require that his sitters pose for him in the studio, but he made an exception for the Wyndham sister, posing them in the drawing room of their family's residence on Belgrave Square. What you see in the background is George Frederick Watts' portrait of their mother, which established their genealogy and so on. He was known, and as I say, he was also critiqued. This is by Sir Max Beerbohm, who made this cartoon. He made actually 17 caricatures of Sargent, of his paunchy physique, as they call. Although he was only in his 40s, Sargent began to travel more and to devote relatively less time to portrait painting. He is another of Sargent's caricature where you see a duchess standing there for a portrait while Sargent is rushing to the canvas with the brush in hand, and you have a little trio there playing some classical music. He went to Italy and made this interesting portrait of an interior in Venice, the portrait of 4 members of the Curtis family in their elegant palatial home. It was a great success, but when he came to offer it to the lady, she refused the painting. And because she thought it was an affront to decorum. And I think this was the thing that displeased her. The fact he was not sitting properly, it was too casual for her. But quite an incredible portrait when you see the rendering of the decor. He's going to paint his friend, William Chase, immaculately dressed, as he was known to be, carnation in the buttonhole. And actually, he purchased the next door property to his home in Tite Street to create a larger studio there. He is the one who painted Teddy Roosevelt's White House portrait, and that one has a whole history. A few years before, so this was painted in 1903, actually 1902, Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt had their portrait made by a lesser-known painter, Chartrand. And the lady, Mrs. Roosevelt, was delighted with the rendering of her portrait. Teddy hated his, but really hated. They had to remove it from the White House. It was put in the side in one of their homes, but he hated it so much that he destroyed it. And so he decided, I want a real portrait painter to do it. And he decided that Sargent was going to be the one. Here you can see on the right a picture taken of that other one, where I must say he looks it's not him. The story goes that they were looking everywhere in the White House where they could paint Teddy. And Sargent didn't like the light, didn't like the background, and so on. And at the time, Roosevelt was in front of him, goes up the steps, and he tells Sargent, I don't think you know what you want. And Sargent says, yes, I know exactly what I want, but we haven't seen it yet. Or you don't understand, something like this. And at that time, Roosevelt, which is just at the, how do you call it, when the first level, turns around and he says, "Yes, I do." And the sergeant says, "Don't move. This is the way I want you." And so this is how he presented him. And Roosevelt adored that painting. He was absolutely crazy, and that became the official portrait of Roosevelt in the White House. A few years later, he is going to be asked to do the portrait of Woodrow Wilson, who he considered very different to Roosevelt, as you can imagine. Actually, he describes him in there that he's interesting looking, not at all like the Kodaks of him in the papers, and very suave and reposeful. The White House is empty, the habitation of the lynx and the bittern. So he had no difficulties with him compared to Roosevelt. He said he couldn't paint him. Every 2 minutes, there was somebody that would come and ask him for this and ask him for that, and he would be distracted by this. And so that was quite a difference. Roosevelt, Sargent, as you know, in 1903 was very busy. And that's the reason why a certain portrait of 4 doctors in Baltimore was not done right away when asked by Mary Elizabeth Garrett, who was the founding benefactor of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. When she decided to commission that painting from Sargent, he said, "You know, I'm very busy right now. I really don't have the time." And the very reason was the portrait of Roosevelt. And so they discussed, and finally it was done only between 1905 and 1906. She's really an interesting person because she is the one almost uniquely responsible for the founding of that faculty at Johns Hopkins. They couldn't gather enough money, and it's really with her and her friends that they were able to raise enough funds to start that school of medicine under the condition that women would be accepted at the same level as men. And here you see 4 of what Mary Elizabeth decided would be the most important doctors. Sargent had difficulties painting this, but to me, when I look at that, I go back 2 centuries and I say, this is Frans Hals and Rembrandt in some of the group portrait he did with people dressed in black. And so he decided to uniform, to give a more uniform look, to have them dressed in their academic robe. But he added some decor to counterbalance the figure. So you have the globe is something he brought in. And then the books that are on the table, one of them belongs actually to Sargent, and the other one is another important book. But so these are Professor Welch, Halstead, Osler, and Kelly, known as the 4 doctors, and it hangs in the Great Hall now after being moved a lot, the Great Hall of the Welch Medical Library. And I have to say, we have a doctor here that studied at Johns Hopkins. I talk about Joaquin Sorolla, who is one of my favorite painters of the time, and to show how the quest for light between Sargent and him, and particularly in Sargent's watercolor that we'll see at the end, they are really almost similar, I would say. Here you see one of his paintings. It's his wife seated on the sofa. They have a very different background, but they knew each other. They worked together at the time for exhibition and so on. And so there's definitely an influence there. Here is the painting of Mrs. Fisk Warren, known as Gretchen Osgood, and her daughter, Rachel. It's just beautiful, that rendering of the light, the projected light on the fabric. He was actually painting her in the Gothic room of Isabella Gardner's museum. He didn't have studio there at the time. And so Gardner decided to have one room devoted to him where he could paint it. By the way, Gretchen was an American actress, singer, and poet. Very tender painting. But you see, when he gets out of the portraiture, his painting becomes so spontaneous. And this is where Sorolla and him get really very similar. This is called the Siesta. It depicts four friends, Dos Palmer, Lillian Miller, and the Harrison brothers, relaxing on the Swiss alpine hillside. So this is during a trip to Switzerland. In 1907, at the age of 51, Sargent officially closed his studio. Relieved, he stated, painting a portrait would be quite amusing if one were not forced to talk while working. What a nuisance having to entertain the sitter and to look happy when one feels wretched. In that same year, he painted his modest and serious self-portrait, the thing that you see here. But then he went on painting for fun. And this painting is the one of a really good friend. She was the daughter of Asher Wertheimer. He had a lot of friends in the Jewish community in London, and that actually caused some backlash. But he was very much at ease with them. He considered very often very cultivated, that were quite interesting people. So the colleagues were not always very kind to him. Camille Pissarro wrote, "He's not an enthusiast, but rather an adroit performer." Walter Sickert published a satirical turn under the heading Sargentolatry, because he became so known, everybody wanted the painting by him. And he is actually that Almira Wertheimer dressed in Turquerie, so in Turkish costumes. But his pleasure was to go around with his nieces. One of his sisters, his favorite sister, who was a little older than him, and who was a painter too, by the way, had two daughters. And he loved these two girls, and they were quite often his sitters for him. And when he paints them, you see there's a really kind of, it smells good. It smells lavender when you look at these paintings. Beautiful highlights, very, very nice to look at. So this is Rosemary Osmond, who unfortunately, I mean, she's going to get married, fall in love and get married, and will die during the war, during one of the bombardment of London. And this is another Nonchaloir, but it's the other niece of his. Again, the way the talent on how he shows these different textures. In 1917, was asked to go and paint John D. Rockefeller. For that, he had to go down on Ormond Beach. And at that time, he's going to make a whole series of other paintings that we will see later on. He finished the portrait of Rockefeller in 1917. And at that time, the critics began to consign him to the master of the past, a brilliant ambassador between his patrons and posterity. But they considered that he was not following the trend of the avant-garde. And he was not interested in that. And so he said, very kindly, he said, "I'm not interested. I don't want to do cubist portraits or things of the sort. I like what I'm doing right now." So he said, Ingres, Raphael, and El Greco, these are now my admiration. These are what I like. And then going in Boston, Bostonian really consider him as a Bostonian. They did so much over there. He lived part of his life there as an expatriate. And he considered Boston to be his American home. So the Museum of Fine Art in Boston commissioned him to decorate the building in 1916 for the rotunda, in 1922 for the colonnade. And he has some works very different to whatever he had done before. He suddenly turns to almost, it's on one hand, it's similar to the symbolist of the time, but it looks very neoclassical. It's very serious, it's almost cold. You can see here the rotunda with the paintings on the top. And then the colonnade. Including the Danaid. You see, totally different. If you were not told that it is Sargent, you couldn't guess. And the famous Atlas and the Hesperides is one of these ceiling paintings that for which he used one of his friends. Here is the study for it. As far as his private life, a lot has been talked about. He never married, had a lot of friends that were gay, and but there's nothing that is really obvious that could say, except after his death, there was a lot of paintings of male subjects that was found, and in a sense give a flavor of what is called homoerotism, the fact that you have men shown in positions where they wouldn't normally be painted by another man, if you want. And so this subject, the sitter, he was a young African-American man who was an elevator, in the hotel. He was in charge of the elevator. But when he saw him, he said he was very athletic, a very beautiful face, really interesting face. And so he used him, McKellar, for quite a while as a model. And he produced this painting. If you are shy, don't look. Otherwise, look. And he made this portrait of the nude study of Thomas Keller, which is at the Boston Museum of Fine Art now. That shows the young man, a very beautiful specimen of young man in probably a position that you don't see too regularly for men. But it's a beautiful painting. He definitely had, before that, a young man who lived for 20 years with him, Nicolas d'Inverno, and who served as a valet de chambre, so a servant, if you want, in the house, but was also a model and a companion of travel. Stayed for 20 years until they had a disagreement, and he went away and got married, and that was the story of it. McKellar, by the way, got married too, and improved from an elevator person to working into a library, of all things. Now, during his career, Sargent painted about 900 oil paintings, but about 2,000 watercolors. And I couldn't show you, that's another talk. So, and this one is long enough. But here are just a few examples of his watercolors, because he is extraordinary in his watercolors. Really, that sense again of light and lightness also. Beside, by the way, this he painted, he also has, we don't even count the number of charcoals and drawing that he made beside that. So quite a production. He did Italy, the English countryside, the Tyrol, Corfu, Middle East, Montana, Maine, and Florida, different paintings. And this is, again, I'm coming back to Sorolla. And so you can see how similar, except apparently, and this really comes from the eyes of a painter, Sargent, according to many painters, never saw the color in the shadow. that there is purple in the shadow. And Sorolla knew that from the beginning. But here is Sorolla, and I love his works too. But you compare to Sargent, and that's quest for light to me. He is in Italy. Somebody mentioned it's everything is given with the intensity of a dream. He dressed up two of his friends to mimic something he had seen in Northern Africa, people playing chess game. On nature, the gourds. And this one that he painted while he made the portrait of a Rockefeller. So the muddy alligators. And it's incredibly well painted when you look at that. It's unbelievable. John Singer Sargent died suddenly in his sleep from a heart condition, likely a stroke or a heart attack, on April 14th, 1925, at his London home. The 16-year-old artist was discovered by his housemaid at 8 a.m. after passing away during the night, with reports stating that he was reading a book by Voltaire just before the end, which is really interesting. It made me think, as if there is a guy who's been everywhere and he's reading Voltaire at night. And Voltaire is that man of the Enlightenment. It's 18th century France. And it tells me something about him, because Voltaire was a rebel. He was going against so many things. So, as I mentioned, he had left an incredible amount of work. And he's been kind of discriminated against because he was not avant-garde, and then he became much more popular again, and he's now one of the most popular artists. And the point I hadn't mentioned is we art historians are very guilty in that, is we try to box people in. That's a cubist, that's an impressionist, that's a this and that's a that. If you're out of the box, we don't talk about you. And it's really true. And this is what happens. And I was reading about an article about that. And it says Sorolla, as well as Sargent, both were kind of kept away from books because they didn't belong to any particular box. And it's by doing biography that you can render them justice. And I say, yeah, I'm doing it. So this was really interesting, but keep that in mind, is that we trying, and that's for the ease, an easy way of having a flowing presentation. You have that series and that style and so on, but you have all the people that don't quite fit in, that are fabulous, but are not maybe totally avant-garde, but great. Look at the Russian that we have seen that are incredible, but they were not fitting the box, so they were put aside for a long time until finally now they recognized. So anyway, don't go away right away. On June 2nd, presented by Freddie Welling, Costa Rica, the beauty of nature and wildlife conservation. This is with regard with an exhibition he's going to have here of photograph of Costa Rica and northern Arizona. It's just beautiful photography. And then related to that same exhibition, I will give a talk on June 9th, The Lens and the Brush, a dialogue of influence. And then starts the summer program, June 16, where silk began, the eastern origins of the Silk Road. Then we'll go to the western part of it, and then we'll go to the route itself in August. Now, here are some of the pictures of Freddie Welling. To give you an idea, this is the under Scarlet Macaws wing. And this is North Arizona. This is the Milky Way. So hope to see you for that talk of his, and come and see the photographs. They are exceptional. Thank you so much. You can put it up. Can you put the light on, please?
Well,